Well, I put on my wooliest sweater for you because it snowed the other day, and it's like,
Oh my gosh.
Okay, we are all set. We are on live and we are recording. And everyone is starting to come on in. Welcome, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are super excited. I'm Midtown Reader, obviously, and we have two special guests with us tonight. We're going to be discussing learning the birds. Before I introduce our guest today, I just have a few announcements. You can be sure to grab a copy of the books for Midtown Reader by visiting our store, calling us, or there we go. Susan, you can also, start, pulling up your books as well. Are going through our website, and we will leave some time at the end of the conversation for questions and answers. So here's a little bit about both the Susans that are with us today. Okay, so about Susan Rogers. Susan Fox Rogers is the author of Learning the Birds, a midlife adventure, and My Reach, a Hudson River Memoir, which explores the Hudson River from the perspective of her kayak. She is the editor of 11 anthologies, including Solo, On Her Own Adventure, and Antarctica, Life on the Ice, which was created while in Antarctica on a National Science Foundation Award for Artists and Writers. Her most recent collection, When Birds Are Near, Dispatches from Contemporary Writers, celebrates the birding life. Thank you. And here's a little bit about Susan Cerulean. Susan Cerulean is a writer, naturalist, and activist based in Tallahassee, Florida, so our backyard. Her nature memoir, Tracking Desires, A Journey After Swallow-Tailed Kites, Georgia, was named an Editor's Choice title. Her many other books include Unspoiled, Writers Speak for Florida Coast, and Between Two Rivers, Stories from the Red Hills to the Gulf. She is a founding member and former director of the Red Hills Writer Project and was named Environmental Educator of the Year by the Governor's Council for Sustainable Florida. Thank you both for being here with us tonight. I'm super excited, and without further ado, I will pass it to you two.
Thank you so much, Kaylee. I'm from the Hudson Valley, so it's sort of thrilling to imagine myself in Tallahassee tonight.
Well, I'll just give you a little update. In our backyard right now, we have a big mulberry tree, and it's full of cedar waxwings. Oh. They're heading your way, and some grosbeaks and chickadees. But the waxwings and the grosbeaks are what's coming to you over the next weeks.
Send them up. Okay. I'm just starting to see the first warblers here. Saw a palm warbler today, and and lots of yellow rumps. But it's happening. It's happening. So.
The yellow rumps have definitely left us. It's such an honor to be your moderator tonight, and I wanted to add just a little bit to Kaylee's introduction, because in really going through this book in detail, I have underlined so many things. And I just wanted to add that besides being a writer and an editor and a bird watcher, a birder, of course, Susan's also a teacher, a boat builder, a rock climber. She's an adventurer in so many different disciplines. And it just made me feel like such a sloth. And she's fluent in French, which I'm just studying. She's amazing. But she doesn't just write this in these words, but to my mind, she also does the really important work in this book, Learning the Birds. It's an essential work of bringing feminism, the voices, hearts, and minds of women past and present into the conversation about birds. And if you're a birder, you are probably seeing this evolving, but it's really important work. And I loved the way that you brought the women in and the struggles that they had in finding their place in, a man's world at the time. But you're leading us. So I just wanted to add that and get you to start us up with some reading.
I want to talk about that because
okay.
You've been birding forever. You did the right thing and started when you were young. And so all these birds are in your bones. I started when I was 49 years old, which is a stupid time to start birding when your hearing is going down and your eyesight is going down and your memory is getting foggier. But one of the women that I found was Olive Thorne Miller, since you're talking about the women in this book. And she was also 49 years old when she started birding, which was to me a great inspiration. She had already written literally hundreds of articles and quite a few books before that. And then she took to the birds when she was 49, and she wrote 11 bird books after that. I'm probably, this might be it for me, but she was truly an inspiration for me in many ways. Yeah.
That's so cool. And you got me wanting to read her stuff too.
Yeah.
But share with us some of your words.
Okay, I'm gonna read from the very opening of the book, which is titled, this chapter is titled, I Wish I Knew. For a moment, the howler monkeys stopped howling. Without the boom of their treetop calls, it was as if the earth had stopped breathing. I followed, holding my breath as I sank into my dinky pack raft, my camera cradled between my legs, binoculars strapped to my chest. The raft felt like it might be losing air, slowly deflating to lower me into the muddy Las Piedras River in the Peruvian Amazon. And then the chorus resumed, a screaming pia screaming, a flock of mealy parrots, so green and more fun than their names imply, bulleting across the lightning sky, hollering their intent, and scarlet macaws soaring high overhead, their long tails trailing as if off to market, calling out the chaos of life. A half dozen chips and songs I did not recognize, tantalizing calls and songs from the green, green world, joined the chorus. The boat hugged me like a sagging bassinet as the current pushed me along downstream to the research station, where I had begun my journey at 4:30 in the morning. I peered ahead to the next bend to see if my three companions were waiting for me, but they had vanished, leaving me alone in the jungle. But not really alone. Yellow-billed terns coursed upstream, Amazon kingfisher cackled the way kingfishers do, Hudson ruffled about in the streamside bushes, a capybara family swam the far shore in a single file, and always the howler monkeys were booming from the tops of trees. Into this ecstatic musical medley, I heard the puttering engine of a boat. No doubt it was one of the long, narrow wooden boats taking Brazil nuts into Puerto Maldonado to be sold. The wake of the boat would surely upset my precarious raft, so I made toward shore to secure myself to a branch or log. As I approached the shore, the log I aimed toward began to move, turned, showed its intent little eyes, and slid into the water. The caiman vanished into the turbid river. I laughed, half nervous, as I realized that for all I heard and saw, there were infinitely more creatures out there going about their secretive lives. This was paradise. An hour into my float and still 3 hours to the station, a long-legged shorebirdie bird with hints of blue and green on its back and a great red eye appeared on a sandbar. I nudged my boat onto shore and slipped out of the raft, camera in hand. As I crouched to watch the bird, it approached, not skittish about having its portrait taken. In that moment, my sense of discovery was acute. Though I had spent my time with the Birds of Peru guidebook, I could not name this bird. I felt a rush of excitement finding this beautiful, unknown to me bird. This is why I bird. The thrill of quiet adventure, the constant hope of discovery, the reminder that the world is filled with wonder. When I bird, life is bigger, more vibrant, and the Amazon, not surprisingly, is the perfect place to nourish such a sense. Though in that moment I was relishing feeling overwhelmed by the natural world, I don't need excess, abundance to get my adrenaline flowing, to have my curiosity piqued. All it takes is an encounter, close or unexpected, something small, even subtle, whether traveling or near my home in the Hudson Valley of New York, to make me thrilled to the day.
That is so beautiful. I'd love to go to that very place.
Oh yeah, you do.
I thought it might be fun for the people who haven't read your book yet, for you to choose among some of these lessons that I gleaned and kind of took note of that I thought were really, really so sharply drawn. And I also want to say to the listeners that Susan's book takes you through her whole journey. So if you're not a bird watcher now, or a birder, however you want to to classify it. It's possible to, I've never read a book quite like yours that takes us from the beginning on through to your discovery of your own way of wanting to bird, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But I thought that if you wanted to choose among any of these to address, I thought these were important things you learned. One was fidelity. I love that concept. Another was how birds taught you about place, which is just terribly important. And another is what birds are up against, their decline, their loss of habitat. So if any of those appeal to you as something you'd like to talk to us about, I found them fascinating in your book.
Well, I mean, I think one of the reasons why I'm so excited to be talking to you this evening here at Midtown Reader is that I mean, I love your work, so that the audience knows I read Susan's work and I approached her to contribute to the anthology that I edited that came out last year, When Birds Are Near. And I feel like our thinking about this often intersects in beautiful ways. And there's a passage in your book about, which is just so beautiful, about, you know, your father and the natural world and how you weave that together. And I feel like we both do that same thing. It's sort of bringing life and birds because that's our lives, but writing about it is not always easy. And I'd love to hear your thoughts about that actually. But this idea of fidelity that you have this wonderful passage in your book about SeaWorld and how it doesn't ask for love or loyalty, but the natural world does require both. I mean, it's just this great succinct way to put it, that the natural world, in order to really care, demands a kind of fidelity. And I feel that I've been able to give that to the birds in a way that I haven't in other parts of my life, actually. That fidelity can come through always looking for a particular species or revisiting a specific spot, or sort of tending to animals that might be threatened in an area and trying to educate others about them. But that kind of fidelity to me is something I think that I've been looking for most of my life. It's about commitment and just kind of giving over. And I think that for me, when I started birding, the commitment that I had was so complete. Once I was in it, it was sort of the classic conversion story. You know, I was there, and I felt like I had walked into a world, you know, one with its own history and language and ethics and heroes and heroines. And I just loved I mean, I loved the birds, but I loved all of that as well. And so I'm straying from your original question, but
that's okay.
Yeah.
let me just jump in though and ask you. You say that was as you got enraptured by birds, you were more committed to them than anything else. Would you say that even writing?
Yes. Yes.
I mean, elaborate on that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, I also feel like I came somewhat late to writing. That my path was, my father was a writer, so of course I couldn't write. You know, I had to do anything but. He was a novelist, and so I mean, I've always written. I have my journals that I've kept since I was 10. But the idea of actually writing came to me much later, and I'd worked in book publishing as an editor, and then when I left New York Book Publishing, I started editing anthologies, and I really started editing the books that I wanted to read. And as I read, and most of them were women in outdoor sports anthologies that I was editing, and I started realizing, oh, I'd like to write this. I could do this. You know, I do these things, and maybe I could write this. And I started to write, and I really struggled with my writing. And so I find birding hard in a satisfying way, and I find writing hard in a hard way, and especially revision. I mean, I'm a slow writer. My last book came out in 2010. That's 12 years ago. So it does. I think what both offer me, though, which I appreciate enormously, is focus and just giving over. And I broke my wrist this winter, and I've returned to writing longhand because I couldn't type for a while there. And I like how my ideas sort of travel more when I'm writing by hand. And that I really enjoy, is sort of feeling quite immersed in something and then letting my ideas journey, as it were. So I do enjoy that. But if I had to pick whether I could go birding or write, I'd go birding.
Oh, well, it's the real world, right? I mean, don't you find that for any one particular anecdote that you want to share, the amount of time that it takes to write it and revise it is way more than the original time you spent in the field.
Oh gosh, yes.
And it's not outside, and it's, it's just
the air's not as fresh, and it's that sort of, when I come across a sentence that delights me, I certainly get a thrill, but nothing like finding a beautiful bird. That's
yeah. Well, speaking of that, let's share our conversion stories. You go.
Me first, and then you can tell. I want to hear yours. Yes,
I will.
Okay, let me see here.
And tell people what that means too, in case they're not already.
Okay, so the conversion story is that moment when I decided to give over to the birds, where I had been, as I've talked, I was a rock climber, I was a kayaker, a backcountry skier, and I was always paying attention to the birds, but I didn't really give over to them. And part of it was that I didn't have the patience, and part of it is that I really felt that it was going to completely take over my life, and I wasn't mistaken. So I'm going to read this short passage here. One of my favorite conversion stories is told by Frank Chapman, longtime curator of birds at the Museum of Natural History, editor of Bird Lore, and founder of the Christmas Bird Count, now one of the great annual birding traditions. He wrote in his autobiography about the moment he decided to focus his life on the birds. It was the end of the 19th century when Chapman found himself working in a bank in order to make a proper living. He met a man, also a banker, and what he saw, he did not want to be or become. As I looked at him, there suddenly sprang into my mind, with the force of a revelation, a determination to devote my life to the study of birds. The sudden and convincing manner in which it was formed had in it something mystical, which seemed to take the matter wholly out of my hands. Chapman was surely aware he was writing about his commitment to the birds as if it were a religious experience. His decision is fated, driven by an outside force, God or the birds themselves. Sudden, soul-moving life choices, no one did it more dramatically than St. Augustine, who chronicled his path in the Confessions. And even though his conversion occurred in 386 AD, it remains, despite we do not live in an age of miracles, a good model. Augustine's conversion did not come without years of hesitations, of wanting his salvation, but not being able to give over. Give me chastity, but not yet, he cries in what is perhaps my favorite line in the book. Chapman too spent years birding before he gave over, left the bank, and became a central figure in the history of American bird life. I too spent years wanting to know the birds, always curious about a raptor spied spinning in the sky, or the songs that accompanied me when I hiked in the Catskills. But as the years marched on, I kept hesitating. Give me birds, but not yet.
That's beautiful. And so remind me of what the first bird was that tipped you over the edge.
It was the veery.
That's right.
Which has incredible, that the song is described as a spiral of white gold. So what was your moment of sort of?
I think I wrote in my first book was Tracking Desire, Journeys After Swallowtail Kites. And that was my first, the first sighting that I had of that bird when I was in my 20s. I was a technician at a field station in South Carolina, and I was in a community with a friend, and I didn't expect it. We were in a cypress swamp, and I just didn't know that a bird could look like that and behave like that.
Yeah.
And that was the one that really got it for me.
Uh-huh.
though, was the same year, and it was on Bulls Island off South Carolina, and it was in a coastal hammock, and it was a painted bunting. So I guess I go for, the glamorous
Great color and
yeah. But the thing about the bunting was that we heard the song and couldn't find the bird and didn't know what it was. And then I had a group of friends. We were all, biological assistants and technicians, and we just got out whenever we could. When we saw what was singing from up in that tree, it was like, oh, this is the world I want to be in. So those were and I was in my 20s, but I think that, you said I've got them in my bones, and I do in a certain way, but you learned them more thoroughly.
I don't know about that.
I credit you with that. Let's see. Would you like to read again, or do you want to talk some more?
Let's talk a little bit, and then we'll talk about Christmas bird count, which I think is for
okay.
both one of the great.
Okay. Well, this question will kind of lead into that. I wanted you to talk a little bit about your writing process. You have a passage in there where you talk about eBird. For people who might not know about that, maybe everyone here is a birder, but it's an online way to be appraised of what's people are recording in your area, and you can also be part of that. And so you got into eBird sometime into your birding life. Mm-hmm. Then you had a little bit of longing about the way you used to record your experiences in nature journals.
Yeah.
And so talk about that a little bit, and then maybe I'll have something to say as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, it really struck me that when I first started birding, I had my little notebook and my pen, and I, every time I saw a bird, I wrote down what I saw and details about the bird that I noticed, whether it's song or movement, whatever it was doing. And then if I most of the time in the beginning, I was with people who were much better birders than me, and how they would talk about them or how they would describe, I would write that down as well. And it felt like such a rich resource. And in fact, as I was working on this book, I turned back to those journals. And one of the things that I feel is lost a little bit in eBird is that we just write down, in the notes, I'll put things like who I was with perhaps, or if it was raining or the temperature, but it's pretty straightforward. And one of the moments that I loved in working on this book is I look at historic figures within the birding world. There's Audubon, and there's Alexander Wilson, who was one of our first ornithologists. And one of my favorites is Edwin Howe Forbush, who wrote this wonderful 3-volume Birds of Massachusetts and Other New England States. And it's sort of like an eBird, but by letter. People would sight a bird and they would write to him, saw towhees in the bush, and then describe what they were doing, and it's just marvelous. But then I also take from the larger historical world, and our former president FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, was a birder, and he started when he was quite young, when he was 12. And his bird journals are a part of the archive in Hyde Park. So I went down and you go into this I'd never done archival research before, which it was thrilling to me to go into this airless, windowless, sanitized room. And I requested these boxes, and they wheeled them out. And there I held FDR's notebooks from when he was 12 years old. And, just sort of this sense of, you have this line in your book. What is it? It's sort of about sort of the devastation of loss of species, and that hit me no more greatly than looking at these journals and realizing the range of species that there was also, besides FDR's journals, there's a guy who birded very actively here in Dutchess County, and he was a friend of the president's, and so his journals are there too. But he would get up at 4:30 and go out to Kruger Island Causeway, where I go out almost every day, and the birds he was seeing. I mean, these scoters flying over and bitterns everywhere, and every now and again I see a bittern, but there's no scoters flying overhead, and so it really, when I read those, there's a sense of thrill of holding these journals and all the past that's held in them, but there's also this sense of devastation that the bird life that was being witnessed, and I think about that.
Not so long ago either, really.
Not that long ago, yeah. And the bird life that, another one of my grandmothers in this book is Florence Marion Bailey, and she has a moment of birding out west, and she's sitting under a tree, and there's 3 different species of birds making nests in the same sycamore tree. I mean, I know a sycamore tree can be big, but it's just the idea of seeing 3 nests, and everybody's describing finding birds' nests. There was just so much more bird life, and that makes me a little jealous, and it makes me a lot sad. And I think, you've written so beautifully about species, I mean, and have been witness to it too, because you started birding such a long time ago. But I feel that, that's something that I find very hard,
Yes, and it's hard. It must be hard as a teacher to talk to your students about that. You bring in one of your really special students, Christina. She
Yeah.
takes up a lot of space in the last quarter of the book or so, and it gave me great heart to see that even though there have been losses, there are young people who can jump on board with what is here now and feel the same thrill that we do.
Yeah. No, to me, going out with young people, I've managed in my teaching job at Bard College to create a course called Reading and Writing the Birds. And
oh God, that's wonderful.
And these kids show up, and they do their presentations on Roger Tory Peterson. They're great. And this morning they were at 7:30 at the bus stop, and I drove them out to Thompson Pond, and they loved it. They just loved it. And at the end of the semester, we always do a dawn chorus out on Kruger Island, and they come out at 4 a.m. Some of them may not have gone to bed that night. I don't ask questions, but they're really excited about it. And so to see a younger generation, and almost all of them, they're like, after we saw the cedar waxwings, I called my grandmother and told her.
That's so nice. I hope my grandson does that for me. That's really great.
It's just really so, I mean, they give me such courage, and some of them go on to in jobs in environmental education, or one of the students who I worked with it was actually before I developed my bird class. He's by far one of the best birders I know at all, is working at Connecticut Audubon and doing incredible education stuff. So it's just sort of, these little pieces, to me feel very important. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I'm really excited to hear about your teaching as well as writing, because I think I'm more selfish about my time. And anyway, I really appreciate what you do. But when you go out in the field and there's something, something like the rusty blackbird, what's your process? Do you write right there, or do you go back and in your memory of those moments? How do you go about that?
I especially when I first started birding, I would go out and I would see something, and then I would come home and just journal about it, and I relied on that. But I think, there might be moments in there where I put the creative into creative nonfiction, sort of conflating various events, and sort of working with, especially for those places that I'm very familiar with, that are closer to home, sort of bringing together a couple of different instances to, create a full story in itself. When I'm traveling, there's less of that. But, in the course of the book, I begin at home, and then I do a fair amount of traveling. There's chapters in Alaska and Florida and Arizona. And and then I return home at the end of the book. And the truth is, and I have a sense this is true for you as well, that your home patches, the familiar is very important, knowing what's out there and knowing what to expect and knowing when those rusty blackbirds are going to be there is important to me, so.
Yeah, for me too. In fact, I don't travel for rarities.
I don't either anymore. Yeah.
It's a whole weird
That's
scene.
a weird thing. That's a weird scene.
Yeah. But when I go out west or somewhere, I always study what I might see, but you lose the sense of, well, the Parula warblers showed up here on March 2nd, the last 5 years. I should be hearing them now. That's much more interesting to me than going out. I mean, it's great to see a new bird. It is.
Oh, yeah.
It's really.
I love coming south in particular, seeing all those long-legged birds.
Oh, we're so lucky.
You're so lucky.
We are so lucky. You're right. Because you've basically got great blue herons and.
Every now and again, a black-crowned night heron shows up. Yeah, but we're a great egret here and there, but the little blues or a roseate spoonbill. I mean, come on.
And the flamingos that you saw too.
Yeah.
I think it would be interesting for people also to hear from you about the competitive aspect of birding and how you came to your own relationship with birding, because I think people can feel overwhelmed. I mean, the thought is you hear, okay, the Christmas bird count, anybody can come, anybody can go on a bird walk, but when you get out there, it's that friendly, right?
Not often that friendly. Yeah. I was lucky that the bird club that I first found, the John Burroughs Natural History Society, named for our local great nature writer. It's a pretty young bunch, and the people there were so generous and kind to me. I feel very lucky about that. And through that club, I met this guy, Peter, who is a big part of the book. And
big part of the book, yeah.
And he's a wonderful birder and was a great teacher, just because his affection for the birds was so intense. And I love in your Christmas bird count account in I've been assigned the single bird, where you talk about how you could quickly identify between the Nelsons and the salt marsh sparrow. And I was like, oh, I still wish I could do that. And Peter was a sparrow man, so I spent a lot of time looking at sparrows with him, and I'm pretty good with them, but not that good.
Well, I'm not good with all the sparrows by any means at all. But, if you spend enough time in salt marshes in the winter, then that's what
you kind of get to know them. Okay.
And you play your little songs and you can hear them. And then I do better by ear, actually, than I do.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah. But I think that the message that we should leave people with is that there are great, generous teachers out there, and not to be put off by the enormity of the task of learning the birds.
Yeah, no, I think that to find, you don't have to find a big group, but just one or two people who will nurture you.
Right, and that's really the best too, because they know what you know.
Yeah,
they can. I had an experience like you did with an early, I was still in my 20s, and I worked at a nature center in Gainesville, Florida, and there was just the most wonderful, funny, marvelous birder that would take us out on trips, and he took us to we didn't know there was going to be a fallout. Of course, you don't always know when the birds are going to fall out during migration, but we saw a Philadelphia vireo. Is that what it was? It was something so rare. He said the same thing to me that your friend said to you, like, you don't deserve that. You haven't gotten far enough in the whole process of learning yet. But sometimes you really do get lucky, and that's the joy of birding.
Oh, I feel like I was crazy lucky in those first years of birding, and partly it was that I birded every day and sort of nonstop, and
That's amazing.
and that makes a difference, if you're just
It does.
hard at it all the time. But I really did have a lot of dumb luck, finding a long-eared owl, finding baby boreal owls. It was really something.
Why don't you read to us about the saw-whet? Speaking.
Okay, this is also a great moment. So
a beautiful moment.
So this is a on Christmas bird count, which for all the birders out there, you probably are devotees. And so this was my very first Christmas bird count, which I was a little hesitant about. It sounded like a crazy thing to do, drive around and count birds. It also meant that we got up at 3:00 in the morning, and I was very nervous about it. So all I did was cook for the 2 days prior to this event, and we had a lot of food with us. So anyway, Peter and I are heading out for this, and we drive out to our sector, which is about a 40-minute drive. And I'll begin where we get to our site here. We slid out of the warm car into 15 degrees of cold. A frozen silence enveloped the woods as the engine ticked from warm to cold. I stared, open-mouthed toward the heavens, a canopy of stars lighting the swampy area in front of us and the dense woods that formed a wall of darkness. I tried to see into the darkness, the open space that was the road leading into denser woods, the clearing in front of us framed black by the night. I shivered, not from the cold, but at the beautiful and overwhelming limitlessness of the world. And somewhere out there might be saw-whet owls. With my first icy breaths, I felt that to be absurd. Nothing was out there, the whole earth frozen. In the weeks before the count, Peter had scouted this sector, which had been his to count for the past 4 years. He drove around to get a sense of what birds were where, which houses might have a feeder up luring in birds, and what habitats he might have missed in past years. During that reconnoiter, he had realized that this remote section, dense with conifers, was perfect territory for saw-whet owls. All owls are special, seen as powerful, mysterious, and wise, but the saw-whet is so tiny, only 3 ounces of bird, that it's all of those things as well as adorable. With a proportionally big head and luminous eyes, it has a cat-like aspect. The saw-whet is more silent in the night than its much bigger barred and great-horned cousins, so finding one by luck or chance as it lets out its song is unlikely. Peter had never heard or seen any saw-whets on CBC before. That doesn't mean they aren't out there, he said. People don't see saw-whets because they don't look for them. Peter paused to be sure I was following his logic while I mused over whether this was true for all of the best things in life. To find the good bird, you have to look for the good bird. You have to believe in them, he said, as if asking me to believe in God. God appearing on this road seemed more likely than a saw-whet, though both asked for me to imagine, believe, hope. But the bird also asked me to be logical, think about habitat and what is possible, stretch for what might be out there. That lesson came at me again and again. I shuffled, waiting for Peter to play the owl's song through his iPod. A canopy of stars lit the sky, yet I did not feel the warmth of their light as the darkness around me squeezed in tight, leaving me lightheaded. After a long pause, Peter said, "It's not working." He slipped his iPod into his armpit to warm it. "I think it's frozen." I gave a half laugh, imagining the iPod on strike, protesting working in such cold. "Whistle," I suggested, though that seemed a silly thing to do when the world so silent seemed empty. Still, though a whistle wouldn't project as far into the forest, we had to try something. And Peter had a talent for whistling out in owls. I had heard him have long hooting conversations with barred and great horned owls. Peter's whistle pierced the pre-dawn air. At first strong, each toot became fainter as the cold took over Peter's lips. That an owl lurked near enough to hear Peter's half-frozen whistle and would grace us with a visit seemed preposterous. Peter paused for a moment, joined me in staring into the darkness and up toward a display of light so sharp and clear I felt lucky to be alive. In that moment, I was willing to believe in anything, saw-whets, God, or the holiness of CBC. In that moment, I became a convert to this annual tradition. A shooting star traced the arc of the sky, then plummeted as if into the trees. Wish. We both laughed out loud. Do stars grant small wishes? May that owl appear, or bigger wishes? May we be happy together? I made both, overburdening that one blaze of light. Wait, Peter said, pointing over the water. Hear that? A weak click like snapping fingers emerged from the woods. I nodded, though I was not familiar with the contact call of the little owl. Peter gave me a thumbs up. Saw it. We both jumped with excitement. Then the owl returned Peter's song, its toots evenly cadenced, sweetly resonant. I strained to make out the silhouette of the little bird, a small globe of feathers and killer cuteness perched on the limb of a tree. I wished those stars shined down even brighter to light the flame of the owl's eye for me. From the other side of the swamp, a second owl piped up. Two. I shifted my gaze back and forth as the owls traded hoots, perhaps discussing these odd two-legged visitors, friend or foe, they might be wondering. The chorus continued back and forth like hollow chimes in the clear air, while we listened, dumbstruck. They really were out there, O ye of little faith.
That's beautiful. I've never saw an owl.
You've never seen one? Oh my God, they're so cute. I didn't come that night, but I've been up to Amherst Island in Canada where there's something called owl woods, and they just sort of sit there like Christmas tree balls. I mean,
Oh my
they're
gosh.
so cute.
Wow. Well, that was a beautiful passage, and it also leads us into the dilemma of the science writer, or this idea of weaving memoir, weaving the personal with this with the science or the natural world. And I was wondering, was that a hard decision for you to make, and trying to figure out how far to go with it? I thought you handled all of that really beautiful throughout the book, and it just pulls the reader. You have so many threads going, not too many, but if for no other reason, people love a good story about a person and how their life evolves.
Mm-hmm.
Two people who love the same thing so intensely can end up together or not. I mean, I thought that was a really important part of your book.
Yeah, well, thank you. Yeah, I think that titration, and I imagine that you've also, thought a lot about this, or the combination of how much of my own life and how much of the birds or the natural world. And I think that, what I always say to my students, because I long taught a course at Bard called First Year Seminar, which is a great books course. And obviously St. Augustine being one of the books that I taught, otherwise he wouldn't be in here. And that there's nothing new that they're going to say about St. Augustine, but what they can add is themselves. And so I think that I'm not really saying anything that new about any of these birds, but what I can add is me and my perception of them and my affection for them and how I'm thinking about it, which only I can do that. And so I feel like I have to give enough of me so that what my point of view is, and that I become a somewhat trustworthy guide, and a guide that is that you want to follow, I guess, for lack of a better way of putting it. So I find that element very hard. And I imagine that for you, because your training is much more as a scientist than mine is. I mean, I really come at this as a writer, and as somebody, as an outdoor person, right? And so I'm, sort of figuring out, I mean, I had to work for the science that's in here, which is not much. It's mostly history, I have to admit. But I imagine that for you, that must also be a real challenge. And I'd love to hear what you have to say about this, because I think you do it beautifully.
Well, thank you. I think that what's so fun about what people say to me, how did you come up with pairing this anecdote with this one about being in the nursing home with the birds, and what to be doing at that point in your life when you're kind of trapped? And it's what I realized one day. It just came to me. These are both parts of my life.
Yeah.
They belong together.
because they belong in you.
Together in me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and people respond to that.
Yeah.
And what's great about it is that you might pull in people who are only interested in this and in the historical
Right.
aspects that you present, or they might be interested in your love story, or they might be interested in you as a powerful, adventuring woman, or they might be interested in the birds. And you give them so many hooks to attach to the story. I think it's really valuable.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I feel that, it reminds me a little of, in reading your book, and I think also of Terry Tempest Williams in Refuge, so we have, we have her mother who has breast cancer, and then all the birds at Salt Lake. And I when I read that, and that was years ago, I forget the date that book came out, but I remember being kind of stunned that here I was so in love with the birds, I mean, the natural world that she's presenting there. But the story that really drew me along was the story of her mother. And I thought, how is that possible? That my sort of, you have been assigned the one father, the one bird, that you have this one parent, and and I just found that so moving and surprising that the story of the mother, really, I was sort of, that's what was sort of making me eat this book in one bit. And I found that very much in your narrative, that I cared very much about the birds, but it was sort of, where are we going next with your father, that I sort of followed along and sort of like the plot, as it were, so I think it adds.
Don't you think it's because we're humans, and we can't avoid being, we're interested in the human story.
Yeah.
And we as writers get to use them to draw people into this larger Earth story.
Yeah.
We're going to be turning it over to questions from our audience shortly, but I thought it might be really, what on page 203 in my copy of your book, and this is a advanced copy, you talked about, I thought this was one of the most amazing pieces of your book. You talked about going to Chartres Cathedral. Then also, if you could talk a little bit about pairing that sense of what it was like to be with a candle with all those people, and then also to be in this difficult physical situation in Alaska and having the same connection with the earth.
Yeah. So the story that Susan's talking about, after I graduated from college in 1983, I headed off to Europe. My sister lived in Paris, so that made it easier for me. And I spent a lot of time sitting in cathedrals because it was a free place to sit. And there was something very powerful about it. So I joined this pilgrimage that the pilgrimage to Compostela has 4 passages that go through France. And one begins at the Tour Saint-Jacques in the middle of Paris, and then goes to Chartres. And so 4,000 of us signed up to do this walk. And amazing. The first night we slept in barns. They had arranged with farmers that we all slept in barns. So we walked out of the city, and we got to these barns, and we slept in the barns. And then to get to Chartres the next day, I think we woke up at 4 a.m. And so still dark out, and we were all given a candle to hold as we walked through these. Oh, gosh. And so we're all holding our candles, and there was just this dot of light around the field. And somebody started singing a hymn, and everybody joined in. And because it was dark and there was just these flickering lights, it was this sense that the earth was singing. And it was really one of these transformative moments for me. It was so beautiful. And so the moment that I bring this up is when I'm in Alaska in hopes of seeing a bristle-thighed curlew, and I'm walking up this hill looking for it, and I slip and fall, and I'm sort of lying there thinking, okay. And a kind of peace came over me in that field. It was for those of you who've been to Alaska, there's a lot of empty, and the land is very powerful. And so these 2 moments sort of resonated for me, that I felt like the earth there was also speaking to me. So it's a very, I always tell my students not to write about spiritual moments, not because they shouldn't have spiritual moments, but because they're so hard to write about. It's so personal. what happens within you when you feel the earth in that way. And I think that for both of us as writers, that this is something we've tackled and are trying to convey, I think, as sort of, as you call it a sacred profession. And I feel that in my teaching very strongly, that it's important to tell these stories and try and convey the power that we can feel if we listen.
Yeah, you really, really do that. And I think that's interesting about the students, and writing about spiritual moments. That would be something that would be hard to teach, I guess, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, they're not allowed to write about doing drugs and having sex either.
Oh. That's a riot. That's very funny.
Those are my only rules.
Those are reasonable. Kaylee, do you have any questions from any attendees that want to ask Susan anything?
The audience, you guys can start putting some questions in the QA feature at the bottom of your screen, but I will go ahead and just kind of kick us off. So how does one get started in birding? I guess, I mean, you guys have been clearly talking. I mean, it's this intricate process. So if I were to move forward with this, where do I start? What do I do?
Well, since I'm the newer birder here, I can tell you that for years I felt like you did, in that I would go out and it's like, how am I ever supposed to learn this? Am I looking for movement? Am I looking for trying to identify the song? You're talking about finding the painted bunting, hearing it, and then not seeing it, and then finally seeing it. And I just didn't even know where to begin. So having a bird club, and I know you have quite a few around you there in Florida, you have your pick, to have more experienced birders help you out, at least to get that baseline. And the other thing, I don't know about Florida, but around here, everybody suddenly in May wants to start birding because the warblers are everywhere. And that's the hardest kind of birding, because you're figuring out what the robin and the tufted titmouse are at the same time that you're trying to identify a black-throated blue. So, the best thing to do around here is to start birding in February and get the baseline of birds, your chickadees, your tufted titmouse, your robin, your cardinals, get all your woodpeckers, figure out what's out there. So that then when the warblers show up, it's like, ooh, what's that? And so those would be my two pieces of advice.
And Kaylee, for specifically here in the Tallahassee area, we have the Appalachia Audubon Society, and at St. Mark's Refuge, which is just a fabulous birding place, there are also, both of those two organizations offer frequent great bird walks. There are duck tours in the winter at St. Mark's. You can go on the boat tour of Wakulla Springs, and whether it's a volunteer or a ranger on that boat, you can learn the obvious big wading birds. That's a great way to start. But I think that the message is, well, a feeder is another way to see birds, but to find a person who can teach you in a group or by yourself is really the best way. Mm-hmm. That's what I would say.
That's great. Thank you. And so when you were, Susan R., when you were piecing this together, this book, what was that process like for you? Was it a lot of early mornings? Was it a lot of research based? I know that you reached out to Susan C. So what was that like?
I always begin my writing with experience. So I would go out and bird, and then I would ask questions. I think at the heart of any relationship with the natural world is curiosity, because for all I know, there's much more that I don't know. And, even all these wonderful apps, they're great, but, they're not always entirely accurate. I had this great experience of hearing what I thought was a yellow-bellied sapsucker recently, and I was like, oh, yellow-bellied sapsucker, and then I heard it again, and I kept walking. I thought, no, I really should stop and look at this bird. And it was a Cooper's hawk. And so I used my app to see if I was like completely insane. And I recorded the Cooper's hawk, and it said yellow-bellied sapsucker.
Funny.
Yeah, and apparently, I spoke to somebody who's a much more experienced birder than me, and she said, yeah, I just heard that this year too. And it's the sound that they make when they're breeding. So for every bird, I think the chickadee has 64 different vocalizations, so there's so much to know. So I would come home from my experiences, and then I would just start asking questions. And I also had a lot of dumb luck in my, not just in the birding, but in my research, finding things that I just wasn't expecting, and that were really wonderful connections, finding out that Nathan Leopold, who was an infamous murderer in the 1920s, was actually not just a birder, but had written articles about the Kirtland's warbler, the rarest warbler in the country, and there he was, capable of tending to baby birds and also killing a human being. I mean, it just blew my mind, So, and that information sort of drifted toward me in the most unexpected way. It was the president of the college where I teach, and he's like, "You've got to read this book. This guy, he birded with Nathan Leopold." And it's like, what? It was James Watson who won the Nobel Prize in physics. It's like, how did this come to me? So I just had lots of kind of quirky luck with my research too, going to the FDR archives as well. And I love the research. My sister's an historian, and the older that we get, the more we realize, oh, we're just kind of exactly the same. We love this research. We love the history, so yeah.
And I don't think that it's so much dumb luck, because you're offering yourself up to this work. And you're open to what might come to you. Yeah. And you continue to do that, and you continue to do that. And I think that in any enterprise we take on, as long as you keep saying, I'm here, use me, me, I love you, I'm here for you, it comes. Yeah. It comes. And
I think that's really true. Yeah, I think that's really true. You do need to, keep your eyes open, your mind open, keep asking questions, and it helps that I walk around with my binoculars everywhere, so that now everybody thinks of me as the bird person, so if they have a question or some quirky movie they saw with a bird in it, they send me a text, and especially my students, it just delights me. They're like, what's the bird? And they give me this terrible description. I'm like, might be a European starling you got there.
One more question. I typically like to always end it on this question, but Susan, if you have a question, you want to toss it out there?
No, I just wanted to say that another resource here locally is Native Nurseries, and they have a really good beginning birder talk a couple times a year, and that would be a really good way to start.
Great, thank you. But for Susan, this is the best way that I like to end these. If you can sell your book in one sentence, what would it be?
It'd be a long sentence. A memoir of a midlife adventure, discovering birds in literature, history, and throughout North America. Kind of.
That's great. It works. It's the one sentence. So as we are wrapping up for tonight, do you guys want to kind of plug in where people can find out more information, where they can pick up your books, all that fun stuff?
I hope you have my book at Midtown Reader. That would make me so happy to think it's being sold in Florida. Yeah.
Yeah, I know mine are. And I have seen stacks of yours on Facebook at your different events. And I think we have a big birding community here. And they should use Midtown Reader as their source for sure.
Great. Yeah.
Thank
Buy
you.
from independent bookstores. They keep us going.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank
Yes.
you so much for having us, Kaylee. This was
Of course.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for spending the hour with me and Midtown Reader. We actually are going to be celebrating Independent Bookstore Day on April 30th. So if you happen to be here during that time, please come on in and visit the store. But also be sure to grab your copy of your book. But that's all for us for tonight. So thank you all so much. And I hope you have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Susan.
Kaylee. Wonderful
Bye.
to meet you. Wonderful to meet you.
Yep. Bye.